Okay, hello and welcome to my annotated artifact tracking sheet for the 2017-2018 MAP scores. MAP stands for Measures of Academic Progress. These scores were taken from my 11th graders this past school year, the class of 2019, at Chesapeake Math and IT Academy North High School in Laurel, Maryland. So with Performance Matters, not only can you get the overall MAP score or the RIT score, but you can also get their scores broken down into individual components, so you can see how students fared with the literature, vocabulary acquisition, and informational text passages. So my two exploratory questions based on this data were: how do we differentiate instruction on vocabulary and how might we do it better? And which close reading strategies are being used for informational text and which strategies are the most effective? So my artifact tracking sheet is right here. So two of my artifacts are assignments with student work. So we have a vocabulary assignment and a close reading assignment. And then the third artifact is taken from Performance Matters, a chart that was created from baseball card data, which was the spring 2018 MAP scores. So I felt that both the close reading assignment and vocabulary assignment demonstrated both a learning gap and an instructional gap. Vocabulary being very significant. It does vary depending on students. Some students do very well with vocabulary. Others do moderately well, and then some students really struggle. Whereas close reading, I would say a bit more students seem to have difficulty with tackling informational text. So for artifact number one, I had students define terms from from a reading that we were doing, and then I had them use each term in a sentence. It says you may alter the tense or inflection of the word to accommodate your sentences. Now this assumes that they know what inflections are. This assumes that they know what I mean by altering the tense. And so I think it's dangerous to make these assumptions because in my limited experience, it hasn't really worked out. I think you need to make sure that students know what these terms mean before proceeding. So here's one example of student work. And you can see little notes here. So one of her sentences says, "The recent windstorm that we just had is an example of a vehement." So she uses an adjective as a noun. So that's something that we need to address. We need to go back over parts of speech, something they should have learned in middle school, maybe even prior to that, but for whatever reason, some of the high school students we see still struggle with identifying parts of speech. Artifact number two, the close reading assignment. So this is actually a work of fiction and not informational text, but the same close reading skills apply, and it is a rather long short story that does challenge students to, focus and extract meaning from the text. So with this assignment, they were to use the literary notice and note signposts, read the story discussed, and then answer reading comprehension questions based on the text. So there are 4 questions here, and then an example of student work. And I think with this wasn't a bad submission, but it's kind of just, there's nothing spectacular about it. She does the assignment, she does kind of just enough without digging too much deeper beyond the literal. and it also tends to summarize rather than analyze, which is a common problem we see. My third artifact is a chart from the Spring 2018 MAP test. And here we can definitely see some of the correlations we're talking about between vocabulary acquisition and informational text, where if a student did poorly on one, they generally did poorly on the other. Again, not always the case. There are outliers, but we tend to see a somewhat of a positive correlation. So triangulation of data. So we have our three artifacts that we've already mentioned. And as I have already mentioned, we did notice a correlation in poor performances in informational text and vocabulary acquisition. So in reviewing the work samples, it was apparent that there was both a learning gap and instructional gap in two of the three artifacts. So clearly I need to differentiate my vocabulary lessons and review the parts of speech. As mentioned earlier, the informational text or a close reading assignment demonstrates a student tendency to summarize rather than analyze and draw limited inferences beyond the literal. So just recapping our meeting, I think something that all of our group members bring to the table is empathy and understanding of one another's situations. So we all had particular frustrations of one kind or another about the project or about something in our personal lives, but we kind of formed a healthy community bond and empowered one another through constructive criticism. So I was a participant in group discussions and also taking notes for our multimedia presentation as we went along, since I am the consolidator for the week. So we chose to use Rachel's data, and so we focused on her artifacts as I took notes. So for data meeting 3, we're now at the point where we've identified some learning and instructional gaps. And so before our next meeting, I need to set target learning goals for the student learning gaps that have been identified. Whether that's having 80-85% of students on the fall MAP test score above a 215 or 220 on each component of the MAP test. I'm not sure yet exactly what that will look like, but I am now focusing my attention on setting target learning goals. And since we are discussing student performance on the MAP assessment, the evaluation metrics will be the 2018 and 2019 fall, winter, and spring MAP assessments. I also plan on giving my students a pre-assessment before that first MAP test so that we can hopefully identify strengths and weaknesses in terms of those key areas: informational text comprehension and vocabulary acquisition. And I can then offer them additional supports to help them boost their MAP scores. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.